Welcome everyone for our webinar today. We're going to give it about 1 minute and then I will get started. For those of you who have attended in the past, may recall our mini housekeeping request in that hopefully you can hear me and see the screen, and hopefully you see Tony too. But if you can just raise your hand, at least one or two people do that, then we know the technology, thank you, is working. So thank you guys for that. So all had the fun of doing Zoom in front of no one for 10 or 15 minutes. So usually all my good jokes are unrecorded jokes, by the way. So so we'll wait about another 30 seconds. We'll get started here. So hope everyone's having a good Thursday so far. I'm going to go ahead and get us started here. So it's right at noon. We had I think, great conversation on Tuesday. Went very, very well. And so the good news is we think that that's going to be the best recorded one, but today could surpass that. We will see, Tony. That our bar is set high, which is fine. So I am Brian Klontz with Charitable Solutions. Have with me Tony Macklin, longtime friend and colleague, to co-present with me today on slippery slopes. Should donor-advised funds grant to or receive contributions from hate, discriminatory, or mission-antithetical groups? So had a couple people, understandably, sort of say, this is an interesting follow-up to our CGA marketing at year-end. So there's not really a thread there to be able to sort of make sense of those two topics, but I think it's very important to note that I was at the National CGP conference in Chicago. There was, I think, a very robust discussion with an affinity group of community foundations, and I would say a third, if not half of that discussion was around this issue. So I've had a couple friends after that come up and say, hey, I know you are looking for webinar monthly topics from time to time, and this might be a really good one to expand or expound upon. So I thought it was a good idea. And obviously, we're going to be talking about some things that are very, very unfortunately going on today in our world, but how charity is responding to that, donor advised funds and beyond, frankly, are, I think, top of mind for perhaps many of you on the call today. So with that, I'm going to jump right on in. So many of you know I typically do the brief overview about what we do as a firm at Charitable Solutions. So you can see our mission for 20.5 years now has been to help charities help charitable gifts happen that otherwise wouldn't, and working with what we always say, a good donor with a good asset wanting to do good things. And so we have a team on our staff of 27 people, 7 attorneys in addition to myself, doing just that. And so we are super busy this time of year, in particular on gift annuities and non-cash, which I'll mention briefly. But I will say, and I want to give us sort of a little bit more time today than we had on Tuesday, you can sort of get the gist of what we do here on the Emergency Assistance Foundation side, doing personal hardship and disaster relief grants, doing what we do today around education, in particular advisor CE, do maybe 65 to 80 of those days out a year for professional advisor CE and or board, staff, nonprofit, donor speeches and training. Doing a lot, by far as our fastest growing by percentage, business line around charitable appraisals. So my tagline is if you can give it to charity through a will, or more specifically outright or for life income gifts, we can appraise it. So you can see all the interesting assets. I've had that comment here for a while saying if you can give it to charity, we can appraise it. And then somebody called me with a horse for a hippo-assisted therapy program. We don't do horses. So you can definitely stump us if that is your goal, but it might be pretty hard. These are all the crazy things that we appraise, and we only do these for charitable transactions. Then we have sort of this sort of 2-bucket charitable gift annuities. So this side around risk management, I have an actuary on staff, done this for 20 years as well, and that is to assess Gift annuity pools, typically larger pools, or where there are situations where a very large gift annuity is being presented that the charity may not be comfortable receiving without some additional risk management. That could perhaps be one of the tools. There are about 4 or 5, but one of those is reinsurance. And then whether or not partial or full reinsurance may make sense or not for a particular case. And if so, we do that design and placement. So gift annuity risk management, gift annuity foundation. So our national separate charity just doing gift annuities. I need to update this. I've got 600 contracts here. We're over well over 800 contracts, growing very, very quickly in all 50 states, obviously with the QCD opportunities with the Secure 2.0. We do this for illiquid gifts as well as for liquid gifts. And the key point here is 100% of the residuum is then passed out to the charity that the donor has designated, which can include multiple charities as well, which might make it easier for them too. And then our primary, probably 50% of our work is around non-cash asset risk management and actual processing and acceptance. So we do some direct consulting from time to time, but primarily our activity is with the Decami Foundation and Decami Asset Trust. You can see there too, we do direct donor DAF investments and as well as concentrated positions in private or public stock. And then also doing the charitable remainder trusts. We're doing that now as a national platform where we can be trustee only or a full turnkey CRT platform. So you can see here about 3 billion of these gifts have been completed to date since inception at least. Average historically, I'll make a quick point here, is 4.4 million. We do about one of those per day roughly. And you can see there the average fee that's on the net settlement proceeds before it's then granted out to other charities. So we don't manage anything liquid with any of our platforms. It's all really as a pass-through or conduit, being able to help capture, again, gifts that otherwise would not come in, good donors, good assets, and good intentions, obviously, too. So very, very briefly, year to date, in terms of our non-cash assets specifically, not including CGA or CRTs, this is through November 30th. Our numbers in terms of donations are actually down about 35–40%, but the average size is up about 100%. That's code for double. So we've received 108 donations, you can see there, for 818 million. We should exceed the $1 billion mark again this year. You can see then sort of the deconstruction of that, the number of real estate gifts of the 108, business interest gifts, and so on. And then obviously the attributable amounts there. We've done at least 2 or 3 more cryptocurrency gifts. I think Ryan Raffin, my partner's on the phone. He's been juggling a fair amount of those this week, given the run up in crypto. So that might change a little bit, but still super dinky as it relates to business interest gifts. So that's still about 90% of what we do. Recall that I said our average is about 4.4 million per donation. You can do the quick math there. It's about 8 million so far this year. Should do at least another 140, 150 million in the next 10 days. So a lot of these are lining up here for year end. So if we can be helpful, give us a call. So Tony, I want to introduce him a bit. Known Tony, I think probably at least 15 to 18 years, at least that long.
I think so. Yeah.
I had some hair then. I think I had hair then. It's actually true. So some of you may not know, but I'm also part of a firm called Ekstrom Alley Clance, which you probably figured out given the name, and have been working with them for 20 years. Tony is a senior consultant within that firm. We really just do management consulting to community foundations. All of our team members have been vice presidents or above at community foundations for at least 5 years or more, sort of working in that ecosystem. And Tony in particular, I was just so pleased and just happy that he was able to co-present with me, because he has both the program side for community foundations, the development donor relations side, has consulted to associations for community foundations, has been an ED for a private foundation, and so just has been everywhere, never mind national. I didn't mention this on Tuesday, sort of national consulting for like National Center for Family Philanthropy and other supporting associations within our field. So just really pleased to have Tony here as well.
Thank you.
So our agenda quickly here is we're going to go through 4 types of advised fund structures, talk about some of the legal and practical advised fund considerations, worldviews, where this can get a little bit interesting, that we're going to talk about there too, in terms of different perspectives at various levels. Then go into asset donor scenarios that we have seen. Endowment fund scenarios and restrictions that also sort of relate to this topic. Grant-based scenarios, which is sort of more the discussion here a bit. And then also Tony's going to be really walking us through sort of this whole section in terms of a decision framework. So I want to be so clear right out of the gate. I know some of you join after we do our little 10-minute pitch, which is fine. That's why I wanted to wait to say this too. But I hope, and certainly the Tuesday group gave us some, I would call it some birth, some grace in terms of talking about this particular topic. We are not going to make specific recommendations at all, but we would suggest thinking about this more intentionally and being able to have a framework and a continuum to determine what might be the best path. We have a lot of different types of grant-making organizations on the call today, which is the point and which is great, but each one obviously has to sort of choose its own path. And there are trade-offs for every choice, and that's what we're going to be talking about today too. And then Tony's got a great sort of resource material that we're going to be sending out next week. So quick housekeeping notes. So we'll be sending out the video next week. That'll be posted on our website. We'll have these Word doc of materials in terms of resources. I would ask again for respect for everyone's opinions, of course, and have any questions in the Q&A portion, not the chat. I think we may have disabled chat. I can't remember, but in the Q&A portion, and we'll do our best to being able to respond during the call today, but likely that will be then added to the Tuesday Q&A, and they'll be having that coming out next week as well. So with that, I'm going to have Tony maybe take us through the first slide.
So for folks who are less familiar with the field, there might be like 4 different major types of donor advised funds. They all follow the same regulations, the same rules, same IRS code, all the rest of it. But you've got one chunk that are national or sometimes even international in scope. You've got those broken down in maybe 3 categories. Some of them are connected to financial services firms like a Schwab Charitable or a Fidelity Charitable. Some of them are independent like DECMI or the American Endowment Foundation, where they're not attached to a financial firm. And then you've got this increasing number of community or donor advised funds, which are specialty products. They are existing to do something really well. Like there are some that just do nothing but impact investing, or a couple that do big trade in cryptocurrency and all of that work. Some that are specialized in employee giving. That's probably some of the fastest growing donor advised funds we're watching, and really interesting how they create their own niches in the world. 700 some community foundations offer donor advised funds, either at local or regional level. Some of them are statewide, and their donor advised funds, like all the rest of them, can give all across the United States. They just start locally. Some 150 maybe faith or politically aligned donor advised funds. Those could be like the National Christian Foundation or local Jewish federations, or Donors Trust for libertarian donors. Most of them are either local or regional if they're faith-based, or a few of them are national as well. And then the sort of term of art more than anything, single issue donor advised funds, the one that are set up by operating charities, so an environmental organization or a university or Rotary has its own donor advised fund. And so they're all different sort of flavors of the same product. At the end of the day, they are all 501c3 organizations, which means, therefore, their donor advised funds, like their organizations, are values aligned. Whether they state those values well or not might be a different thing, but they are values because they are charitable organizations. One of the things that we've noticed, though, is that trust in the nonprofit sector and philanthropy keeps plummeting over the 2000s. That's a whole nother webinar at some point. But one of the things that has proven to rebuild trust in the public of nonprofits and philanthropy is much more charity, much more aligning your action with integrity, and being much more inclusive about developing policies and procedures. So we'll come back around to that. If you're not clear about where you stand on some of these issues in your donor advised fund process, it may be time to revisit that so you can be more transparent with your clients.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Tony. And I would say maybe a couple quick comments too. You might even have, for example, sort of a faith-based. This isn't where it's sort of national, more local faith-based, but obviously there are national faith-based foundations. There are some that might be independent, but are also doing employee giving sort of pieces. So there are a lot of permutations. And one that we didn't discuss prior would be there are a number that are specialty that actually would have cross-border giving, so doing international grant making as well. So the wonderful thing, I think it's wonderful, is when I started in this business in the mid-90s, we did not have this. I mean, it was very, very different. And as there are more and more sponsors, they have different niches, which then obviously both on values, but then also just on facilitation, might be better matches for certain types of donors. So I would also say that these numbers really come from the obviously approximations that are drawn from the National Philanthropic Trust annual survey on donor advised funds. So these numbers don't just come out of my head or Tony's head. These are really coming from that research that they do on donor advised fund activity more broadly. So let's talk about some legal and practical DAF considerations. So legally, in bold there on purpose, the donor advised fund can receive any kind of asset, legal asset, and really give to any public charity listed on what's called Publication 78. So Publication 78 is the cumulative list of any public charity that has received exempt status. And I put on there literally until the moment that that charity has that status revoked. And I think there's some technical considerations that if you have reason to believe that it's going to be revoked, that could be sort of a murky area, a lot of murky areas here. And one thing that's particularly important is there is a presumption that Publication 78 is always accurate. It is not. You'd think that it would be, that some charities have actually received their exempt status, perhaps even a few months or longer ago, and that are not for whatever reason appearing and or have been revoked and continue to appear. So we have a whole other layer of interesting here. Why is this all capped and underlined? Very clear. We're talking about donor advised funds, obviously, on the webinar here today, but this is the same for any donor making a gift from any bucket. So I can, as an individual donor, make a check contribution or stock transfer to any of these charities listed as a public charity and get my full deduction. And obviously for a private foundation, the donor advised fund is simply a vehicle to facilitate that philanthropy. And I want to really emphasize this. You can hear my tone, I hope, that there is a lot of, I think, undue vilification of donor advised funds. Well, you can do all the same stuff with any other charitable bucket, I mean, or just the check. So just to be very clear, we're talking about donor advised funds, but it's more broad than that. Practically, there may be considerations around mission, obviously reputation, legal, tax, that would be then informed through policy. So that's really what Tony's going to talk about a little bit later. But I want to make this very, very clear. Historically, I think this is also important in the mid-90s. Two things. One, most people, in terms of new prospective donors, certainly in the mid to late 90s, were suspect of making any kind of contribution to a donor advised fund because the question, and I would use the word always, came up, when would you ever decline my gift? That was the question. Every time. And by you, it meant the board of the sponsoring fund. And so what was communicated generally, I'm speaking for hundreds of foundations now, generally communicated, if it's on Publication 78 and not doing anything wacky or illegal, we would be able to make the grant. And by the way, there are a number of these, in particular in the faith-based community, where churches, for example, are not required to get exempt status, as many of you know. So then we had a whole other process to say not only is it Publication 78, but it's even beyond that for faith-based organizations that are not required to do that. I will say, I think this is funny, I ran this as part of a donor advised fund at a community foundation, and we had our administration or a processor would sometimes come in and she goes, oh, we've got another IRCH. And I'm like, what's an IRCH? She goes, it's not quite a church. So like, that's pretty good. So there'd be some level of due diligence that we would need to provide for that. But the point is, I ran that for 7 years. We did thousands of grants. I honestly cannot remember one or two could have happened where there was some kind of controversial issue that might have otherwise come up. This is happening daily now in many cases with very large donor advised funds. So that's why, again, we thought this might be a helpful sort of topic to go through. Next, there was, I think many of you would remember if you've been doing this a long time, a controversial history with the IRS around approving 1023 exemption applications. Now, a lot of this conversation today is going to be sort of on both sides of the continuum. So let's talk about both sides. One side would be on the conservative side. It was they're targeting political or religious-based conservative groups and denying that application. The other side was they said those groups seem to be doing things that would not otherwise be charitable, and therefore the term used was extra scrutiny. So you got targeting and you got extra scrutiny. It was not a good look for the IRS. I don't care what side you were on. And the point is that they got their hand beyond slapped on that publicly, congressional hearings, et cetera, which then perhaps has led to a much more liberal approving of new applications. So it's roughly 99% of all applications now are approved. And then they said, well, wait, we actually think there'd be a better way to make it easier to get exempt status. And we're going to come up with the 1023EZ application, which has nearly a 100% approval. Not that 99% is not near 100% anyway. It's even easier, easy, to get it approved here. Horrible to say on a recorded webinar. If I want to do something crazy wacky, I'm doing a 1023EZ, and that thing's getting approved. And now I'm on a publication 78. I'll do it in about a month. And I mean crazy wacky. Even everybody on this call would say, yeah, that's crazy wacky. That should not be a charity. So this is the history and sort of, obviously the past that's sort of creating the environment today a little bit. So ground rules, again, some civility, respect. It did not get bad at all on Tuesday. Let's hope it doesn't as well. But we're going to talk about some things that are pretty controversial. These are not about situations that are right or wrong as we go through donor cases or grant cases or asset cases. You can see my role is super laissez-faire bad cop. So bad cop is, by at least this definition, if it's on publication 78, why are we having this conversation? Make the grant. Even if it's not on publication 78 and it's a little bit more of a church than an urch, make the grant. And Tony, which is great, sort of gave me a teachable moment saying, well, in fact, that actually is a value and that you're trying to inspire more philanthropy, put more charitable capital in play, good stuff will happen, all boats will rise sort of model. But we've got Tony here playing the role of sort of values-based good cop. And the point is that we might be taking some sort of stronger positions. Now, I'm going to tell you very quickly a case that came up with Decamai, where it was a non-cash gift we received. Donor wanted to make a contribution. We're about as agnostic as it can get. If it's on publication 78, we are making that grant just based on our model and what our board's sort of position is. The point is, we did have a large grant that came up. Donor wanted to make a grant after the asset sold. We're like, sounds good. I guess made the mistake. I'm like, that's charity I've kind of heard of, not really. I'm typing into Google, not good stuff came up on Google. Like first page, not good stuff. FBI issues, embezzlement issues, not good stuff. So I spoke with the board about it. The board said, it's a little bit too much for us. Maybe see if you can find a better way. Long story short, went back to the donor and said, look, we're not real comfortable making that gift. It'll show up on our 990, not too keen on that. If you can find any other donor advised fund to make that gift, or fiscal agent for that matter, they're public charities, they can do a fiscal agent transfer. We're happy making the gift to them so that it's not showing up on our 990. They were able to find a group within 48 hours. We made the grant over to the new group, then they made the grant out. So even laissez-faire bad cop is saying that's a little bit too much. And I even am playing devil's advocate against myself going, well, Brian, what did you actually accomplish? What did your board accomplish in that? You made it more annoying for the donor. Every dollar went to the same place anyway, just because we were chicken. Third, they were charged a fee in making all that happen. So what was actually accomplished? That's the other side of my own sort of decision. So I'm not as bad cop as it may sound, but the point is that will be sort of the purposes of this call. And then you can see in there, I'm not that bad. And Tony, definitely not that good. So I want to make that clear too. But we do think an extreme is a little bit strong, but taking sort of these positions to be able to sort of better understand sort of where each charity might fit in terms of their policies and what's comfortable for them and their community. So with that, a couple quotes we think are interesting. So only one problem with tainted money, there tain't enough of it. So that is at least attributed to the Salvation Army founder William Booth, and shares what's called the washed clean philosophy with Sister Teresa. You can see here, if you don't stand for something, you don't stand for anything, or stand for nothing, fall for anything. Alexander Hamilton. We are our community's foundation and should represent everyone, said by all community foundations. And then if you can find something more liberal or more conservative on our 990 grants list, let me know. So this is where the donor would ask us, when would you ever say no? If I want to do something very conservative, very liberal, I would just say, look at our 990 list, call me back if there's something on there that is more liberal or more conservative than what you're considering as well. And again, that was very broad for a community foundation. This one is interesting. So Tony found this one. So you can see here, sort of practically all the spare money in the country consists of a massive rent, interest, profit, every penny of which is bound up with crime, drink, prostitution, disease, and all evil fruits of poverty, as inextricably as with enterprise, wealth, commercial perfidy, and national prosperity. So I think if anybody has their wallet and you have a $5 bill in your wallet, you do not want to do a forensic accounting of where that literal $5 has been the last 20 years. You do not want to do that. So the point is, like, what do you do with it today as an example? So sometimes the source, I'm not saying, again, for better or worse, but money is fungible. And we have this pool of money, and the fungibility, oh, the donor advice fund won't allow me to make that grant. Okay, I'll write a check. Same money, different pockets, different buckets, but you're still giving the same amount to that same charity, as an example. So here we go, right out of the Rick's, having fun. So various worldviews. So what if your donors were a mix of these people? So you've got, obviously, from literally sort of left side, left politically, to right side, right politically, and things in between. What if your donors were a mix? And for many of you, they are a mix. Staff were a mix. We're seeing this more and more with grant-making foundations, where the board would identify, if you force them, good luck with that, force them to sort of pick one worldview. Staff might be one or two over from that, which can create some interesting dynamics. Board were a mix, and your community is a mix. That's guaranteed. So how are these worldviews reconciled? So again, the point here is to be able to say, how can you, as a grant maker, being able to receiving gifts or making grants, how do these worldviews, just as a proxy, obviously. So unfortunately, everything's through a political lens these days. So just to be able to sort of lay that out. So as an example, we got developing policies. So this picture, for, I would say, a large majority of our population, they would see freedom-fighting patriots being able to try to protect basic fundamental rights and protecting our democracy. And another large group of our population would say, when we see this, we see domestic terrorism. Why would I put this particular picture up, which is obviously very controversial? It is critically important to understand that not only do each of these worldviews and each issue, every single issue just about that is impacting our community and our world today, have public charities attached to both sides of those issues. Every issue. So even on this particular one, there are dozens of public charities on both sides, more on the sort of legal protection side. So you can see here, Patriot Freedom Project, Oath Keepers Foundation. These are Publication 78 public charities, period. They've been validated by the IRS to be able to allow people to say they are doing charitable activity based on their exempt status as the arbiter of that particular institution. Who defines hate and discrimination? Is it objective? Should that definition change? When does that change? Who makes that decision? How is that communicated? These are things, again, that at least from my experience, did not come up in the late 90s. The last 3 years in particular, we are having clients bringing these things up all the time. How do we deal with these particular issues for donor advised fund and beyond, to be clear? So how do they change over time? So this is just one example. I'm not a historian. Don't, mark this as fact, but generally speaking, the U.S. government funded an Islamic militant group, Mujahideen, for the Afghanistan during the 80s war because they were against Russia, and we were against Russia, and we said, we'll fund you. Then a lot of these leaders here, once they basically defeated Russia, ended up becoming the Taliban. So we called them freedom fighters back then. Then they became the Taliban, like, whoa, now they're against us. That's different. Now they're terrorists. So you get the point is these things can change pretty quickly in the whole sort of spectrum of time. And then two, we certainly have this with just as an example around the religious faiths. So also not a theologian, not an expert in this area at all, but the point is generally, most faiths have branches. Branches are created literally by these policy schisms. And you might have a branch within a particular denomination, as an example, that's Orthodox, conservative, traditional type branch. What distinguishes that from the others? Generally, there might be gender rights differences or educational differences. There are some other types of differences, typically, that are adhered to. You have sort of mainline, sort of generally more in the middle, sort of balancing sort of both sides, and then perhaps more liberal, progressive branches, more rights for all people, no matter what. The point is, sort of as those change over time, this group might think this is a hate type group, and this group might think this is a sort of discriminatory hate type group. So again, it's all worldview and perspective. Then we talk about sort of asset and donor scenarios. So now we're going into which ones are actually received by DAFs or any other charity that's not even a DAF. These are all situations that we've experienced in the last 24, 36 months. Crypto declined by environmental DAF for environmental reasons. Makes total sense. Massive amounts of energy use. They're actually exacerbating that situation, so they're going to decline that. Recall, however, the William Booth and the Sister Teresa is, well, if we can take in the crypto and sell it for cash and then actually try to abate some of these issues, is that not better? Not saying you should. Just saying those are, again, all trade-offs and perspectives. Crypto declined in this case, which is very interesting to me, by a national DAF because they could not get comfortable with sourcing, basically the know your donor, sort of know your customer sort of rule. And then I had an interesting sort of discussion saying, yeah, but do you know the rule, or do you know the source of any of your cash contributions? Like, what do you mean? Like when you get a wire in cash, I'm horrible here. They could be a heroin dealer, collected the cash, done small deposits at the bank, and now they're making a grant over to you. You have no idea the source of any of those cash contributions. At the extreme, maybe, some would say, maybe, I'm not putting words in anybody's mouth, but even like a capitalism would be a sort of a nefarious source, as an example. So all these have sort of different perspectives, again, on sourcing and what is sort of right and wrong. This was actually a case too. Strip club building declined by a local community foundation. This one was an inheritor, large interest in oil and gas. She did not like the fact that her family had made the money in that way and wanted to be able to make a gift of her entire interest, significant interest, to environmental groups. And all of them declined that interest. And she was frustrated / befuddled, not realizing, you're going to sell it anyway. Just take this and do good with it. Sort of back to similar to number one here. So again, they were not comfortable being able to receive that. Cannabis stock, you see this, and then you get into specific donor scenarios. We could go on for an hour with examples here, right? This is becoming more and more prevalent. In many cases, a response to some kind of negative reputational attack or issue is to make a grant back to the organizations that are otherwise been sort of harmed in that case. Well, that creates a whole other set of issues. So you can see here Weinstein donation, Sackler family donations, and so on. Then we have endowment scenarios. So what does that mean? Endowments last, you think you know how long, you don't. Forever. Perpetuity, fun to say. Perpetuity means until the end of time as we know it, and no member of our human species continues to inhabit our planet. So now you're creating a donor advised fund, or more specifically in this case, perhaps an endowment or a designated fund, maybe even a field of interest fund for that matter, specific for a program, specific to an individual charity. But now what if they have hate policies? What does that mean relative to that particular organization not fitting today versus they may have fit 10 or 20 years ago? And so this actually came up during that affinity group discussion, which I thought was great. And they said, well, we would just use variance power or Cypre doctrine to be able to repurpose that endowment income, those grants that we were making. And I sort of made the comment, I was like, well, wait a minute. Actually, variance power, if you read that, says you actually have to find a similar charity serving as near as possible that purpose. Uh-oh, what does that mean? Now you're right back into the same boat to the extent that you're sort of following the lines of variance power. There is actually a fund right now, probably a lot of them, that exists at a university for a agricultural student that is committing to go into tobacco farming to enhance yields. 30 years ago, maybe 40 years ago, they're like, that seems reasonable. Now, like, that doesn't seem reasonable. What, should I have a donor advised fund grant be made to a scholarship fund for that particular topic when we've got people dying, from cancer that is now known, but was at least less previously known? What does that mean? And then, of course, endowment fund for churches. I know the Council on Foundations and others sort of have specific protocols. I know a number of faith-based donor advised funds have these as well, that now a church splits based on some philosophical division. Now it has a new branch. Well, you had an endowment fund for the one specific church. Now there's sort of potentially with two different EIN numbers, potentially. And so now what does that mean? What was the original intent? Do you know what that was? And so on. So all of these can change based on these various policies. So with that, I'm going to pass it over now to Tony, sort of take us through some other steps here.
Sure. For those of you who are watching, if you've got questions or comments, feel free to use the question and answer function of Zoom. We'll try to catch some of those live if we can. So various sources that we were looking at gave some guidelines as you're looking at your gift acceptance policy, and it may be time to revisit it in the sort of life of how your values and ethics show up in your organization. So one is clarifying those values and principles and thinking really about what's the impact on different stakeholder groups if you take a gift that has any of that stuff that Brian was just talking about. People, if you're serving women, how would they feel about that gift? Or if you're serving homeless people, whatever the case may be. Second, increase your due diligence. Some people call it a know your donor policy. This is where you have to decide how far do you go in that, and maybe you create a threshold. Often it is like, we'll only do this for complex gifts or naming rights gifts or gifts over X amount, because you can't do it for all of them, or gifts of illiquid assets, something that's more complicated. So some people would say it's really just about the who's making the gift. We're not going to do the rest of it, and have some kind of values or ethics aligned to that. For others, it's like, where was that money earned? Because certain industries that we're not going to take gifts from, or certain kinds of ways that people gain their assets from slave trade or something else. And so we put that in there. For some people, it's like, we're not comfortable with anonymous sources because we can't track any of this stuff. So we don't know if that's a good or bad donor to our eyes. Some organizations have recommended creating a separate ethics committee. Your gift acceptance policy committee might be sort of the technical, legal kind of folks, but maybe you need somebody to sort of hold up your organization's values and ethics and say, this is who we need to live by. Does this actually diminish our organization's integrity or not by taking this gift? Or can we renegotiate the terms or just say no? And then you may come back to your gift acceptance agreements, any naming rights agreements, and say, do you need to strengthen either variance powers or morals clauses or something else to say, if this feels uncomfortable for us 5 years from now, 10 years ago from now, or you as a company or person change, we have a right to renegotiate. Not everybody sort of caught that piece of it in their agreement. So you might come through all of those. The resource sheet that we'll have posted with the recording next week will have some direct links to some resources to give you some ideas. You're on mute, Brian.
Now I'm off mute. That was good. Muted myself. So grant scenarios, I just want to make a couple comments here. So this is Chronicle of Philanthropy had an article, lots of articles, fortunately, unfortunately, probably more unfortunately, and it has sort of millions donated to hate groups, and they sort of specified, I'm not 100% sure within the title, from 351 charities, but they specified sort of from donor advised funds. I was like, oh, that's kind of interesting. So then you actually read into the article, and it said 80% of the 351 were from private foundations. So they really focus on the 20% of donor advised funds. And you can see here my quote, 2 beers in 10 minutes, and I could come up with a pretty good justification as to why about 75% of all grants could be hate, discriminatory, or mission antithetical to someone. And I don't drink. Those of you who are actually on the longevity webinar that I actually did my own personal life expectancy, based on all the different attributes. And one of the things was, cannot make it up, that it literally had that if I would exercise 2 days less a week and drink at least 2 drinks a week, my life expectancy would increase by 2.2 years or something, which is just crazy. My point is that donor advised funds, unless you have a very clear value mission area, so faith-based as an example, environmental group as an example, et cetera, but that are broader than that, it is no win. It is a no-win situation. I could take 10 of your grants, I don't care who you are, 10 of your grants, and I could come up with some pretty good, I would bet, justification as to why that would be hateful or discriminatory or antithetical to someone. And the point is, if you then say, okay, we're not going to make that grant, now you actually are potentially discriminating for either political or religious reasons. And now you're right back into that boat. So it's like, if you basically say, we're going to follow publication 78, and if you have concerns or issues about that, as many charities do, say, you need to take that up with the IRS. We're just looking at this from a public charity standpoint. The point is that you're going to have people, we're hearing this from a lot of clients, that are getting very upset with them for making those grants. But the converse, I'm kind of playing bad cop here, but also realistic, pragmatic cop, the reverse is you start saying, no, that maybe perhaps has not been communicated clearly. And then that can be viewed actually as discriminatory or hateful as well. So that's sort of the point here, is why it's becoming, it is such a slippery slope there too. So with that, I think you're going to take the next one, Tony.
Yeah. So we're going to dive a little bit into the hate piece of this, and then lift back up to some recommendations that might work for other kinds of values, environmental, faith, whatever the case may be. For the folks that are interested in this or haven't been tracking all the details, there are FBI definitions of terrorism and hate crimes, which can be the basis of a policy. Most charities will not hit this level, but at least you know you've got some rooted definitions that you can work from. Next slide. As Brian mentioned earlier, on the flip side, the IRS and FBI aren't exactly working well together, or at least in alignment. So you've got the IRS denying less than 1% of 1023 applications. The IRS's own internal auditors found out that it has granted exemption to organizations that were later found to be ineligible or scams, especially the 1023 EZ forms. And so it's screwing itself up in some of this. And misalignment between IRS and FBI, nonprofits can currently support organizations on the FBI's foreign terrorist list. There's some new legislation that might change this. It's just in the works. We don't know what will happen, but people are interested about nonprofits that were funding money to Hamas, for instance. Next slide. The other thing is nonprofits can provide education, one of the sort of root charitable causes or charitable activities, but not propaganda. Again, there's a sort of legal definition of propaganda, but it's really hard to tell the difference on these sometimes. And the IRS, because of the pressures and otherwise, has sort of abandoned trying to do so. So it follows if there are certain methodologies that look like propaganda, but it will not dive into the content of a nonprofit. So if your board's saying, let the IRS handle it, as Brian already said, it may or may not be sort of great due diligence to just follow publication 78. Next slide. Good cop ideas. So hate speech, again, for common definitions, has no legal definition in the United States. Other countries, yes, not here, except when it creates immediate threats of violence. And again, there's been some argument about what's an immediate threat of violence. FBI and police have one idea, some other folks do not. So Nonprofits and donor advised fund sponsors have to choose some kind of definition that an academic organization or another nonprofit has created and use that, or at least riff off of it. So it means that nonprofits you grant to can legally vilify, humiliate, disrespect people and groups of people and their viewpoints. And criminals have said that nonprofits have inspired the hate crimes. It's been on the books, which is super frustrating and horrible, but it is what it is, at least in our society legally these days. And some scholars will say we've sort of over tried to protect the First Amendment on this. We've got other rights, safety, and freedom from intimidation that maybe we need to be paying attention to. So next slide. So the Council on Foundations, if you have not run across their information, they have a whole website on values aligned philanthropy. Great research, well worth downloading and talking about with your staff and your donors or even some community members. And one of the things they've reminded donor advised fund sponsors is obviously you have a full right to refuse a donor's advice, part of donor advised fund. B, charitable organizations and donor advised fund sponsors do not have to enforce the First Amendment like a government agency. So any board member that says, oh, we can't violate donors' First Amendment rights by saying no, that's not true. You have the right to say yes or no matter what grounds you decide on. Write them down, be public about it. You can work to reduce harm to your communities and to reduce harm to people. It's certainly a great thing. And again, a true charitable intent. And the council will say that there are community foundations and donor advised funds that say, we refuse to tolerate hate and intolerance in our communities while we still respect that individual donors may have viewpoints all over the spectrum. And we'll see an example of that in a minute. So you can sort of walk that line legally and as best as you can. Next slide.
One point I would make quickly is this sort of has full right to refuse a donor's advice prior to the Pension Protection Act in 2006, where it was not clear if a donor advised fund sponsor could actually follow the advice 100% of the time from donors. We actually had in Atlanta at the Community Foundation, we would actually keep a file of any of those that were otherwise declined, because our general counsel was like, look, if the IRS ever comes in, you just do not want to show that you've been making a grant every single time that the donor requests it. So anyway, I just find this so interesting. It went from, actually you're sort of, this sounds horrible, but kind of looking for reasonable reasons why not to make the grant. And most of these were very clearly, they weren't publication 78 or so on, to now you're like, oh yeah, you can make all the grants. Oh wait, now we have the, additional sort of values filter. But
other notes from the Council on Foundations, again, for everybody in the Horizon Forum, which is a national charity, has been working on some things with the council. Again, don't rely on the IRS for quality. Approach hate speech as a community safety and inclusion issue, come at it from that sort of value set or principles. They also say you might watch for things like anti-democratic extremism. Again, that could be controversial in some communities. Convene internal learning sessions so your staff and board are all talking about this together. Some people might say even include some community members in that. Clarify your values and principles. The recommendation is no matter what you decide on in terms of what is hate speech or not, or what is anti-environmental or pro-environmental or not, there's always going to be gray areas. Somebody asked in the Q&A, could they use your vision or purpose or mission or purpose? Maybe lots of times mission statements are a bit too vague or big picture. And so coming back around to stated values or principles or codes of conduct, whatever your organization does, probably works better. And then make sure you've got updated policies and procedures. One of the things that we've seen in community foundations, maybe other donor advice providers, is the CEO and board have got to own the communications with donors and fund advisors. So if you're implementing a new policy or if you're having to enforce it for the first time, that shouldn't be done by the grants manager or the philanthropic advisor or even a VP of development. The board and CEO are going to say, we back this policy 100% and we're willing to call you and say, something's not working well for us. We need to flag something for you. So just be aware of that. We've seen a couple of cases where the staff farther down got sort of hung out to dry. It's not a great thing for the community foundation. Next slide. So as Brian and I were chatting, we came up with some ideas about maybe you could create 4 levels of due diligence for donor advised funds, or perhaps it's like call it 4 value propositions. You can decide what's your value proposition really for the donors that you're bringing in. The first one's the basic one that Brian was mentioned earlier. We're just going to check the public charity status. We know it might not be great. The IRS isn't flawless, but we're just going to go with it because we can at least legally do that. Our value propositions were simply a conduit for money, or for some donors, like, hey, we actually do less due diligence than you can on your own. because you could do some poking around on the web without us and find some stuff that's sort of squirrely about nonprofit organizations. Second level then. Next slide. Thanks. Whoops. So level 1, plus for some foundations, they'll do some basic scanning of those nonprofit listing services because stuff can get flagged on GuideStar, Charity Navigator, the Better Business Bureau, the Attorney General website to say, okay, just basic cursory look, something legally here is off base. They are in trouble legally for something. They're financially gone to crap for 5 years in a row. Maybe there's something else that we're flagging. It's just really basic. You're basically trying to de-risk for fiduciary reasons. And some donors are just happy with that. Like, great, have my back to this organization hasn't gone cockeyed on at least some of the basic kind of nonprofit stuff. For those nonprofits or donor advised fund sponsors that do this, they're usually offering those results with an invitation to call. They're never denying the grant. It's just like, hey, by the way, you want to know this? Give us a buzz if you're concerned about this fiduciary thing. So maybe sort of a yellow light status. And this is what we did when I was running a family foundation in Pittsburgh. We did that kind of analysis for our board members. They were like, oh, happy to know that. I didn't know about that little library in wherever, New Hampshire. Third level up. So level 3, you do level 2 plus. We're going to start scanning the websites, social media, news sources for reputation risks, controversy risks, values misalignments. Again, hate, environmental, faith, whatever the case may be. Might check against existing lists if there are lists out there that somebody's created that we can borrow from. And then we're going to offer those results and express our concerns to the donors to say, there's some stuff here that I think you would not be happy with and we're not excited about. Let's talk about this. These organizations at level 3 will say, we're flagging all that stuff. We're still probably going to pass it through unless it's sort of, illegal, but we just want to say, we want to talk about that. And for the foundations that do this, donor advised funds, again, most of the time their donors are saying, I'm so happy you did that for me. I didn't know all that information. Let's do something different. 1 or 2 donors maybe no, but they're happy to have you de-risking for them and at least flagging something because all that stuff can come back in the news, and you've probably seen it, right? Community foundations get caught in a news cycle and, oh, they were on this list. Here's this grantee they did. Like, no, we didn't mean for that to blow back on us or our donors. The final level, level 4, is the conversation's been going on with community foundations and other donor advised fund sponsors over the past 2, 3, 4, 5 years, which is we have a set of organizations we are just never going to make a grant to, from our unrestricted funds, designated funds, and donor advised funds. And we are going to mostly do that based on some kind of values or ethical alignment. And we're going to call the donor and say, this does not fit our ethics. Can we help you do something different? Back to Brian's example, would you like to write a check to them separately? Do you want to do that from another pocket of some kind? Does not sort of absolve the long-term analysis of that organization getting money, but at least it keeps the organization, the donor advised fund or foundation, having some kind of integrity in the way use of the money that's at their place. Somebody asked in the Q&A, should we make the public our level our organization or due diligence uses? And the answer is yes. Again, back to earlier, transparency is your friend and builds trust. Even if somebody doesn't like what you're doing, at least you are transparent with it. And you can say we are holding up and living out our value propositions, values, principles, mission, whatever the case is. And so usually it's over the course of a year that we've seen community foundations, other donor advised fund providers say, we're working on this, we're giving you some signaling about what we're doing, it's coming in 6 months, we're turning it on. So there's lots of communications along the way to make sure donors and fund advisors know what's coming. And then it gets embedded in all of the new stuff. So it's in the new donor advised fund marketing materials, the new donor advised fund ingredients agreement. So it's all in there for the stuff that's going on coming after that. So a couple of example language, and there's plenty more out there again in the resource list. One from the Council on Foundations: we do not police the ideology of our donors. We do not allow grants to groups that promote violence. And so this community foundation is like, we have our own values. We are not going to judge you as a person, but the money's now in our court, and we're going to have this money live by our values and principles. Even for values-aligned organizations, here's Donors Trust, a community foundation as they describe themselves for libertarian donors. They put this on their website. In line with our commitment to private philanthropy and limited government, we don't allow grants to nonprofits that take significant portions of revenue from government. nor to groups whose work undermines the advancement of liberty. And they have that directly in their materials. It's on their website. They've got at least 2 or 3 articles that talk about where donors have been happy that they had this available and were flagging organizations on behalf of the donor to say, or fund advisor to say, this doesn't follow the values that you signed up for when you put a grant or put a fund with us. And donor, what do you want to do about that? So we've got a resource list, 3 or 4 things that I'd highlight from that. If you haven't run into them, we mentioned the values aligned philanthropy materials and the Council on Foundations and the Horizon Forum, probably working more on the progressive side of this issue. Horizon Forum's collecting different kinds of lists from the Southern Poverty Law Center, but also organizations that are maybe been identified as anti-Semitic or anti-Muslim or doing harm to LGBT communities. And so they've been trying to sort of aggregate some of that information. All the theory works means more progressive. The Markula Center for Applied Ethics is one of the great places to turn for some initial conversations around ethical or values aligned gift acceptance policies. And one we didn't have on here, but it's on the resource list. There's a great international charity called Global Giving. They have a website called Ethos, ETHOS, and they basically made transparent their own journey on this issue. What did they do to make their giving and grant making aligned? And they talked a lot about ethics and integrity, a bit less so around values. And so they have a couple tools that they built for themselves that they've now shared to everybody else. And so you can download those tools and use them internally to say, let's talk about the ethics of this, and let's run through who's going to be involved and when, and how fast are we doing this process, and all the rest of it. Well worth downloading and chatting through internally. Implications for our community foundation friends before we get to the resource list. And Brian, I'm interested in you on this since I'm playing good cop on this, right? Especially for community foundations and their faith-based peers, maybe the single issue foundations. I think all of this means that eventually they've got to stop trying to say they can be everything to all donors, right? At some point, you have to decide that some donors are probably better partners to you and your mission than others, and you can't take all donor advice funds, or you're not a best suit or best fit for all donor advice funds. And so your asset development goals ultimately may need to change to say, we are going after certain kinds of segments of donors, and you have to be comfortable saying no to folks and saying, we're not a great fit for you, but here's somebody else who is, or here's another organization who is. That's not where everybody is yet, but I think it's where folks are going to have to keep talking about and really considering over the next years.
Yeah, I think that is an incredibly important point. The great thing is there are about 1,000 of these exist because of these various niches. And sort of, as I mentioned, those niches were not as clear, certainly 15, 20 years ago. They are now. And so we've got a number of clients that have biblically based guidelines around values and what they're doing. And so it I think in a great way, sort of the continuum is there, and then how different donors sort of find their way either initially or longer term to sort of the right fit, and for the foundation to feel that they're the right fit or ideal donor, I think is really key. I will also say, I will not mention her name, but there's an estate attorney who was at this same group discussion, and they were talking about sort of hate and issues. And Tony and I have done many board retreats before, and I always used a consulting gimmick line, which is basically I could get 100% of the board right now, insta vote. It will take 30 seconds to vote to say we cannot be all things to all people. 100% of the time, 3 seconds. Then you say, okay, now who are we not going to do something for? And all hell breaks loose, right? So it's the same kind of thing. If you say, oh, we're talking about hate, well, oh, we're not doing hate. My point was this attorney had just done an estate plan for a particular foundation. It was going to be an endowed fund. And they came back and they said, we are just not comfortable, kind of a bigger than yellow light. We'll call it an orange light between yellow and red. And we said an orange light, not so comfortable on this particular endowment because they sort of represent hate or potential violence. And this like 80-year-old woman's like, I don't know what you mean. I've been active with this particular organization forever. You're saying things that I don't know what that means. I mean, so it is you need to be very clear about sort of what your fit is, and then, as Tony has said, how that is otherwise communicated. But I think it very much is rapidly changing in terms of what that value proposition is for donors, how that then is reconciling those worldviews among all these different constituencies. and then how that manifests itself through policies, if there are changes at all anyway. And that's sort of the point. So hope that's helpful. The point is too, on the other side, again, sort of, God hath no fury, how, making a grant to a place that another donor would never make a grant to. And then, as I mentioned before, then if you say no to that, then that's the fury coming back the other way. It becomes, again, no win again, unless you're very clear on those values, that's communicated for those donors that want to accomplish that gift, to say, we are unable to do that within our framework, but here are some other groups that might be able to do that. So with that, I will, fantastic job as always, Tony. I think we got 1 minute left. This is just simply a list of all of our past webinars. We did not include the 2021 list because they've gotten too long. So it's about 40 or so now, 35 or 40. This will be, again, added to our list. These webinars are on our CharitableSolutionsLLC.com website as a resource. But we really do hope, I hope very personally, I know that this is not a more typical topic to talk during the giving season, and really would not feel compelled to ask Tony to share this time and his great information in this framework with you, but for the conversation that came out of the affinity group, and just the fact that deluge is not the right word, but it is constant hearing every couple of weeks about, oh, we're struggling with this case, or this asset's coming in, what do we do? And
Yes.
and to be real blunt, everybody is reacting. Everybody's strong. Most people are reacting versus being thoughtful and intentional about what is their framework from a donor perspective, asset perspective, grant perspective, and, which Tony has always been great points to say, how then does that not manifest itself not just through the grant side, but what is now happening with the investment side, what happened with the asset intake side, the donor side, the staff side. So more and more, this becomes sort of a full integration for those charities, and specifically community foundations and others that choose to go down that path. And there are trade-offs every step of the way down that path. And so that just has to be eyes wide open in terms of that journey. So I hope, again, this is helpful. Tony, thanks so much, as always, for your great good cop perspective.
Happy to do it.
But we're glad to be with everybody. Have a great holiday season, great year end, and if we can do anything at all, let us know. Thanks so much.